Well, good morning, everyone. I am not Edmund Prater. I think if I understood Mike's call yesterday correctly, Edmund had some significant car trouble that kept him from being able to come back into town. And so I think we are on the same lesson anyway from where my class is. So we just thought it would be a good idea to hop in here. I do see a handful of people from my class, so I guess they're getting the word that this is where we're meeting today. We want to be in Psalm 22 today, so if you have your Bibles, that'd be a great place for you to be turning. This entire quarter, we've been talking about worship. We've been talking about different elements of it, particularly from the Old Testament. So far, we talked about how worship began in these rudimentary ways, and it evolved through the dedication of the temple, studied Hezekiah's prayer, talked a little bit about Passover, and we find ourselves, again, all the way through some of these Psalms, and we're going to be in a really powerful one today, Psalm 22. But before we begin, I always start my class with a little bit of a discussion question, so I thought we could do that today. And I wanted to know if there was a meaningful song to you or a particular song lyric maybe that has meant a lot to you. And I know this is a Bible class, but don't cheat and use some hymn that is, Amazing Grace has always been a lot to me. That's cheating. What is a song or song lyric that has maybe been really meaningful to you? Ooh, James Taylor, You've Got a Friend. What is it about that has spoken to you?
I have a dear friend that I've had for years and years and years, and that's just kind of our song. And then when Matthew got married, that's the song we danced to, You've Got a Friend.
So it's a connection to a relationship and an event for you. Yeah, so I love that. Others? Josh Groban's You Raise Me Up. What is it about that song? I mean, I could guess, but yeah. It's really powerful lyrics, and the music is, the way it swells and all that, it speaks to you. Yeah. Others? Yes, sir. Zane Williams, Hope is a Flame. Now, is he the ACU guy who went off to Nashville? Yeah. I'm not familiar with that song. What is it? Is it the song in general, or is there a lyric?
The lyrics are great. Hope, he compares hope to different things. He starts out, he says, hope is a flame. Then he compares it to several other things. It's a real good song.
Yeah, so he's got this metaphor about hope being a flame that speaks to you. That's good stuff. Others? All right. So some of us are writing our own lyrics here this morning. It's just interesting how music speaks to us, and there are certain songs that, they get stuck in your head or stuck in your soul, and they stay with us, and they punctuate these meaningful moments. And that's what I think is so interesting about the book of Psalms being included into the canon of Scripture, because essentially what this is it's like taking 5 songbooks and putting them together and saying, this is going to be a book of the Bible. These are literally 5 different hymn books from the Hebrew times, from the ancient, Israel times, and they put them together one. The fact that there are 5 actually shows up because some of them repeat. You'll see literally word for word sections. You'll see that sometimes. You also see certain motifs and themes in the same way that, now we don't really use songbooks anymore, but when you look at our songbook that's in our pew rack, you'll see there's certain themes, how they're collected, certain there's certain ones that were for communion, let's say, or I think they even put patriotic ones together, different themes, ones about heaven, different things like that. And there's kind of a similar idea. When you look at the Psalms, you can kind of see how that goes as well. And by one estimate, there are about 6 different kinds of psalms. You've got lament psalms, which we're going to look at today. You've got thanksgiving psalms, wisdom psalms, praise psalms, psalms of Zion, or sometimes those would be lumped in with psalms of ascent. Those were the pilgrim songs they would sing as they're going through Jerusalem for the festivals. And you've also got imprecatory psalms, which are some of the most fascinating. Imprecatory kind of being that, hey, will you make my enemy suffer type psalms. And that's language that we don't always feel super comfortable with. Like, you can pray for God to do that to people? Wow, I never knew that. But what we've got is, you've got these lament psalms, and that's kind of what we're going to focus on today. And there's a bit of a structure to them. You kind of have three parts. The first one is the part that we're the most uncomfortable with, because it's the complaint part. It is the, why, God, are you ignoring me part? Why won't you do something part? And then there is the petition part, where God is being asked. It's this cry from help. Look upon me and answer me, dear Lord. And then the other theme that you see emerge, which is fascinating to me, is there's always a praise at the end. There's this idea, this anticipated response from God. And you see that over and over and over again. Psalm 22 that we're going to look at today, it has all three of those elements. And I want you to notice something. There's a superscription there that provides some information regarding the context as well. It says, first of all, it directs the director of music to sing this psalm to a tune apparently that was known to the original audience. It's obviously been lost to us, but when it would be a little bit like us saying, this is from the tune of O Susanna. We all know that tune, right? It would be something like that. But I also want you to notice that it says a psalm of David. I don't want to ruin anything for you, but it's something we have to be very careful about. When we say it's a psalm of David, a lot of people will just go ahead and make the assumption that David wrote the psalm, which very well might have been the case, perhaps even likely the case. But it's not necessarily the case, because when you say a psalm of David, what you could be saying is, I am dedicating this psalm to David. You could be saying that I'm writing this in the theme of David, or the style of David, the idea of David. Or you could be saying that we have always associated this with a part of David's life, something like that. But what it doesn't necessarily mean is David absolutely wrote this. Again, he might have, but I just don't want to make that assumption. And that's why oftentimes when I'm reading Psalms or preaching Psalms, we'll say the psalmist. That's kind of the safest bet for us. But if I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm going to go away from that theme, even though I just told you that. I'm going to go away from that and say David a lot, because my notes say David a lot. And in this psalm, it's pretty clear that David, or the psalmist, felt abandoned and isolated and in danger. In the verses 14 and 15, his body is failing. He's talking about being on the verge of death. His enemies are surrounding him. They're eager to attack. They're eager to strip him of everything he's got, including his clothing. And what's interesting about that is the writers of the New Testament are going to pick up this psalm, and they are going to use it to connect his suffering, or the suffering that's talked about in this, to the suffering of Jesus. And specifically, it's going to be talked about in the crucifixion itself. Jesus himself will quote from this psalm while he's on the cross. But it's also quoted other places in the narrative of the New Testament. For example, verse 1 is quoted in both Matthew and Mark. Verse 7 and 8 is alluded to in Matthew. Verse 8 is... verse 7 and 8 is alluded to in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Verse 8 is alluded to in Matthew. Verse 18 is quoted by John, and verse 22 is quoted in Hebrew. So, again, some people call this the Psalm of the Cross, because when Jesus said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, he is quoting in Aramaic this psalm. All right, let's read it. And I tell my class all the time, I have no idea who chose the pericopes of this. I don't know why we're going verses 1 through 11 and not covering other parts of, I don't know why it does that, but that's what it does. So we'll just go verses 1 through 11. All right, here we go. We're in Psalm 22. For the director of music, to the tune of the doe of the morning, a psalm of David. Verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and they were saved. In you they trusted and they were not put to shame. Verse 6, but I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. Yet you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you, even at my mother's breast. From birth I was cast on you. From my mother's womb you have been my God. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no help. Now already, when you read these words, you may be thinking to yourself, this does not sound like a lot of songs in our songbook. We don't really typically sing these kind of songs. What we often have we have praise, and we have thanksgiving, and we have hope, which we need. We need those. There are certainly times in our faith journey where that's what we need to put forward. But what I worry about sometimes is I worry about the people who walk into our worship and they are carrying incredibly heavy burdens, and they do feel like God is far away from them, and the language of our hymns don't match the song in their heart. And that's what I love about a psalm like this, is it is offering us language that we sometimes need in our faith journey. It's telling us it's okay to pray like this. It's okay to sing like this. So I think this is incredibly, incredibly powerful. All right, what I always do in my class, we read the whole thing, then we go back verse by verse. Let's do that. Look at verse 1, the beginning. My God, why have you forsaken me? So again, we got this seemingly hopeless situation. David is crying out to God, and I love the idea that he's saying, my God, God, capital G. We're not just, hey, any old God. We're specifically talking about Almighty God, not a pagan God, but the God that he had a relationship with as well. It's the idea of my God. And it's so dire that he had this question where it's like, why are you so distant? Why have you forsaken me, he says. And what's powerful about that too is, you go back and you look through the promises of God to the Hebrews, and one of the most powerful promises was always presence. You know, I will be with you, I will be with you. So it's like, hey, where are you? You said you would be with me, where are you? And again, I already mentioned this, but while suffering on the cross, Jesus quotes this very verse, which, I'm a preacher. I could pull over and park and preach on that idea all day long. Just the idea of everything that was happening on the cross. Jesus felt that God was turning his back on him, that he was looking away from him, that he had been forsaken. And that's just this powerful moment where the suffering led Jesus to feel abandoned by the Heavenly Father. And he quotes this psalm as a prayer, and he gives word to the anguish of that moment, the rejection that he felt. Just really, really powerful. Look at the second half of verse 1. Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? It's the idea where, not only does God seem far away, but like the rescue seems far away. Whatever help that he might have seems a long way off. And I like that phrase. I don't like it, but it's powerful. My cries of anguish. This is that really, truly depth of despair. And I hope that you haven't experienced that. I hope that you don't have to experience that. But the truth is, if you live long enough, you will experience that. Those cries of despair, this groan, this idea of I can't even give words to this, the way I'm feeling. And I just want any means of rescue. I don't want to feel this way that I feel. Sense of being abandoned by God. Keep going, verse 2. My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer by night, but I find no rest. So I like this idea that this plea it's not a one and done. It is, nope, I'm not going anywhere. I'm coming to you night and day. I was thinking about how, as a parent, your sleepless nights evolve. I remember when Maisie was first born, I discovered very quickly I do not do well with sleep deprivation. There was some crazy stuff that happened the first week of her life where I was just so tired, and there were sleepless nights where you're like, I'm going to go crazy if I don't get more sleep. But then your sleepless nights evolve, because your sleepless nights when your kids are newborns is a lot different than when your kids are teenagers. Your sleepless nights are sleepless for a whole totally different reason. And it's not even at that point, it's like I remember when I was a young adult, I remember when my parents would talk about, or Maggie's parents would talk about how they couldn't go to sleep until their kids were home. And I was like, that's so weird. Like, what do you mean? Like, just go to sleep. Like, I don't get it. Like, what does where I am have anything to do with your sleep? And then you become a parent of a teenager, and you can't sleep until your kids are home, until you know they're safe. And so it's interesting, this idea of the psalmist tying sleepless nights in here, right? Where it's by day and by night. I find no rest. And again, a lot of times when you're in despair, what's the last thing you think about when you fall asleep? What's the first thing you think about when you wake up? It's your anguish. It's where you're at. And again, I love this song because it gives voice to that feeling that we sometimes have, as awful as it is. Let's keep going. Verse 3. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. So it's interesting. The psalmist is like, why do you seem so distant, God? But it is then affirming the unique characteristics of God. You are enthroned as the Holy One, and it's proclaiming that God, you are the Holy One. You are free from blemish. And by the way, that was God's holiness was sort of the foundation of worship for Israel. That was one of the ideas they went back to a lot. God, you are other. You are holy. You are perfect. And we are not that. You are so distant from us because you are your perfection. And now it's this idea that, God, you seem distant, but we acknowledge that you are separate from us anyway. And then I also like this idea here. You are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. So we talked about this in our Bible class recently, about how God's presence with the Hebrews, it was illustrated, or it was represented maybe with the Ark of the Covenant being almost like a seat for God. Like, you had those cherubim that with their arms outstretched, and it was like, it represented God's presence among the people, that you are, here. But you think about, where was the Ark of the Covenant? It's behind the curtain, right? I mean, God is present with us, but He's kind of hidden from us. And here you have this almost idea of God being enthroned in the midst of His people. You are enthroned as the Holy One, not over there somewhere, not separated, but here among us. And so I want to pause and ask you a question. And I think I want to go back to that idea of holiness, that was the foundation for the Hebrews' worship. In what ways do you think we could better emphasize God's holiness in worship? And when I ask you that, I mean certainly our corporate worship, the worship we do together, but also in your individual worship. Is God's holiness a theme of our worship? Go ahead.
Personally, I have to, for me, I always think of praising. I don't think specifically of praising as holiness. I just think of praising God. And so I would have to say, no, I don't think holiness is in my mind.
Yeah. So she's saying that when it comes to worship, it's about praise, but not necessarily His holiness. Go ahead, Reg. Yeah, so maybe the idea that we are quiet represents His holiness. That's when we go to reverential places, what do? We lower our voice. So maybe that's a sense of the worship of God's holiness. Yeah, so he's talking about, and I'm sorry if I'm only repeating this for the live stream folks. He talks about how a lot of that is represented by us wanting to cleanse ourselves, prepare ourselves to be in His presence. So maybe that's representative of what we do before we go to worship, is recognizing I'm going into I'm going into the presence of God in a special way. It's yeah, just I think the reverence and respect, and maybe again we've become too casual, right? That sometimes we don't do what Gary's talking about, where we go in with this sense of awe. But I think it's a really important concept of establishing God's holiness. I think in our own life, like, because we're talking kind of corporate worshiply, I think in our own life, like one of the things that I've learned to do in my prayer life from time to time that I come back to is just starting my prayer with the adoration aspect of God. That God, you are perfect, you are holy, you are wise, you are loving, you are slow to anger. You know the plan for my life. You know me inside and out. And when you start in that posture, you're acknowledging His otherness. Because I will sometimes even pray that. And I am none of those things, Lord. I'm not that. So again, I just thought that was something I want to pull over and park on for a second. Look at verse 4 and verse 5. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. Now, this is a very common thing in the Psalms and other places where it is the history of God's work with His people. It's giving me confidence because I'm looking back and what you did before. I know you did that then. I know God's people trusted you and you were close to them and you saved them. And so it's this encouragement regarding His presence in the past. But I also want to talk a little bit about, he says, our ancestors put their trust, they trusted you and you delivered them. And then it says at the end, they trusted and were not put to shame. 3 times in these verses, you've got a form of the word trust, and you've got this tension between trust and suffering. You have feelings of sadness and anger and fear, and those are associated with a lot of grief, and that's a very normal human emotion. But in those moments, what you have to get to is, you have to get to that trust, that trust that God is present. He's not abandoned us. He is with us in our grief. He's present with us, and He'll be faithful. But that's why I think there's this tension here between both we cry out in our suffering. We cry out in our suffering. That's okay. Again, the psalm is giving us language to do that. But we trust. But we trust while we do that. I trust that you'll take care of me. I also love this idea. In you, our ancestors put their trust. I don't know that I've ever used the word ancestor in any of my prayers. Interesting concept here. Maybe ask yourself, who is an ancestor of yours that demonstrated trust in God during a season of suffering? How far back is the psalmist talking?
My grandmother, comes to mind.
Yeah, your grandmother. A lot of us, when we lost our grandmother, we lost the person who prayed for us the very most. It's an ancestor, yeah. Yeah, our nation's founders who had a lot of faith and suffered a lot as well as a result of many things they were doing. Go ahead.
You mentioned that, in the context of lament, you mentioned your kids. You think a lot about how you fear for your kids and your grandkids and what they're facing now. And you think you start thinking that, oh yeah, our parents had it good. It was so much better. It was so much better for us. And you fear for the things they have. In this context, I think that might be some of what he's saying. Oh, they had it so much better.
Yeah. John's saying, you think about this in context of your kids and your grandkids, and, we have this tendency to think, oh, that people before us had it so much better. We're worried about the future. But you're one step ahead of me, because my next question in my notes is, how will we demonstrate trust in God so that we can be an example to the future generations, so that they can pray my ancestors were faithful and you answered their prayers. I'll just throw that out there rhetorically. We don't have to actually answer that. But it's an interesting thought exercise of what foundation am I laying? What are my kids and my grandkids seeing in me, particularly demonstrated when I'm in the midst of suffering, when things are hard? How am I demonstrating my trust in God? When he seems distant, what do we do? What language do we use? Very interesting and powerful thing. Verse 6. Now here's, again, we want to talk about language we may not use in our prayers. But I am a worm and not a man. Again, never prayed that prayer before. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. Worms, it's not that different today. They are represented in those times by destruction and decay and death. And David has this self-identification as that, this extent of his negative self-assessment. You know, I'm feeling really lowly. And apparently, we saw a peek in the scriptures we read. His enemies are probably aiding that thought process. They're probably using some of that very language, and he's sort of identified this language. And so he's got these threats that are pretty vile, and he's afraid that they've kind of come true here. And the Lord's going to have to intervene on behalf of the psalmist to have this freedom from this dishonor and this shame. And that's one of those things too, by the way, that I've read so many of the Psalms and the Proverbs and the wisdom literature, but other places in the Hebrew Scriptures where shame is, especially like public scorn, is this big theme, and maybe we have trouble like relating to why that's so terrible. Maybe we don't, but the idea is, your reputation was everything. And so if you've got enemies that are taking pot shots at your reputation, that really is, it's really devastating. And so there's an element of that here. Verse 7, all who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their head. So it's like, hey, God, you seem silent here. My enemies, they're not so silent. They're taking advantage of the situation. They're making a spectacle of my suffering. They ridiculed the psalmist. They heap insults on him because he trusted in God. And it's this shaking of the head of disdain and disgust. Verse 8. This is the sarcasm here. He trusts in the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. And so this is a moment that probably hasn't happened to you much. Have your enemies ever quoted your prayers back to you sarcastically? Making fun of you because of the prayers that you're praying. But apparently that's what's happening here. You got these sarcastic tone, this harsh tone, and the confidence of David's enemies is displayed in this inability for his God to rescue him and deliver him. There is this refusal to believe that God's going to intervene. And it seems like their insults have a kernel of truth. It is, hey, this sarcastic invitation, it's probably inviting some doubt and even more lament by the psalmist. It's like, hey, maybe they're right. And I don't want to belabor this point too much, but God's people often feel scorn, we feel ridicule, we feel like we're being made to feel foolish for our faith, that's empty and that's meaningless. And in those moments, you have to trust that even amidst the mockery, even amidst the ridicule, this is my trust, this is what I believe, and this is truly who I am, and I do believe God will deliver me. All right, we got some since birth language here, verse 9. Yet you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you, even at my mother's breast, from which I was cast on you. From my mother's womb, you have been my God. This seems almost like self-talk at this point. It's this narrative that the psalmist is trying to change inside that inner monologue, right? It's listen, you've been my God. You've been there since I was in my mother's womb. And it's this reminder of all the ways that God has provided in the past, literally all the way back to when I was in my mother's womb. And from conception throughout the childhood, it's this trust that is not just based on good feelings. It is confidence in this certainty that this previous demonstration of your provision is there, and I'm going to rely that that's going to happen again. And it's this trust that God's going to provide. You have been my God. That's going to continue to be the case. All right, verse 11. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help. The psalmists frequently petition for the nearness of God's presence when they face trials and suffering. And I wonder if that's not a really powerful point to highlight. And I don't, again, I got to be careful how I say this. When I'm very fortunate that I get to read the prayer requests with the rest of the staff every week that come to Pleasant Ridge. And I admire the great faith of the people of Pleasant Ridge to continually petition God. And a lot of what we do pray for is the deliverance from the trials that we're facing. And I think that's legitimate. The Bible would say that, give us encouragement. James tells us, pray for those who are sick. I mean, the Bible tells us to do that. But there is an element, too, where it's not just about taking away all of our trials. And one of the things I try to pray as often as I can, particularly for other people. Maybe I need to do a better job about this myself. But when people are going through really hard times, what I pray so often is, God, let your presence be felt. Let your presence be felt. Because again, it's not, I know his presence is there in the midst of whatever terrible thing people are facing, but I don't know if they feel that presence. And so God, I just invite your presence to be felt by them. And I feel like, for whatever reason, as I get older, that's a more meaningful prayer to me than just take this away from them. God, if he would take it away, that's wonderful, and we'll praise you, God, if you do that. But in the meantime, let your presence be felt. I just want to pause and just say, thoughts on that or anything else so far? Go ahead.
I love the last line of the message on this section is, I need a neighbor. So in the context of God's presence,
It's like, God be a neighbor?
maybe be a neighbor.
Oh.
Or send someone to them with a message of hope.
Yeah. He was saying in the Message version, the paraphrase version, it says, I need a neighbor. Yeah, that's good stuff. Again, we're getting into New Testament stuff too about being a neighbor. That's good. Other thoughts or questions? Go ahead.
How well this fits with the theme of the lesson, but it is appropriate, I think, for us to feel a little disconnected from our greater society when we're Christians. But I also think there's a tendency for us to associate that feeling of difference, isolation, separateness, and confuse that with that being how God is interacting with us. I'm not sure that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I think if I could paraphrase what you said, it's the idea that we confuse what is happening to us with our relationship with God somehow, or is that
Well, in essence, I mean, we're supposed to be different and distinctive people.
right?
As Christians, we shouldn't feel that comfortable in the world we live in.
Right.
But that discomfort is really easy, I think, to get confused
Yeah.
with feeling isolated from God.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the idea of being aliens and strangers in this world makes us uncomfortable, but that uncomfortableness sometimes gets mixed in our soul with the distance of God, that he seems far away. And I do think that is where, the rubber meets the road in faith, right? That we do believe God is with us despite what our circumstances are telling us, despite how uncomfortable we feel. Steve, you look like you had something to say. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, you don't realize that God is all you need till God's all you have type situation sometimes. Other thoughts?
Last week, we were discussing about how David was praying for God to bring down his wrath on the enemies, and I was watching football yesterday. Well, it reminded me, I saw helmet-to-helmet contact, and in 1963, they'd have said, good leg. But now they say, you're on the bench.
Yeah, yeah.
And David lived under different rules. He lived under an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Then 1,000 or so years later, Jesus came along and the rules got changed.
Yeah, turn the other cheek.
Enemies.
Yeah, and so maybe there's a lesson there too about looking at the language here through the eyes of the New Testament as well, and through what Jesus came to do. Powerful stuff. All right, let me see where we're going to be next week. It is going to be Psalm 25, so just forward a few chapters next week. Psalm 25, and I think we should be back in our normal classes then. So